This is Dr. Todd Shaw's POLI AFAM 402 course, African American Political Thought. Topic 5 lecture, Black Marxist and Socialist Thought. So in this lecture, I'm going to discuss, as is true for all the other schools of thought, the genius and contradictions of Black Marxist and Socialist thought. Here I'm showing you a picture of Robin D.G. Kelley's award-winning book, Hammer and Hoe. Hammer and Hoe, Alabama communist during the period of the Great Depression. Believe it or not, that there have been, throughout periods of African American history, ways in which African Americans, particularly grassroots ordinary folk, in the words of John Galton, dry long-so, all ordinary folk, who have been attracted to elements of socialist or communist thinking. And so what I'm going to do in this lecture is lay out sort of the broad premises of Black Marxist and Socialist thought. But before I do that, remember that we have discussed my models, my various diagrams of African American political thought, and have discussed how these diagrams map out the broad philosophical principles as well as the ideological concepts of Black political thought. Well, I thought that relevant to the election that occurred in 2016, that it may in fact be the case that African Americans are in a state of flux in terms of political ideology. And Michael Dawson, who I've drawn on his work quite a bit in this course to kind of lay out my thinking and my theories, Dawson sort of talks about the ways in which Black political thought is a series of schools of thought. And in particular, he lays out this concept of Black disillusioned liberalism. Now, what is Black disillusioned liberalism? It's a school of thought that is between various schools of thought. So if you look at these diagrams, my global diagram of African American political thought, of course, to the left I have my 7 philosophical principles: resistance, representation, relevance, responsibility, reinterpretation, reclamation, and reverence. And those broad principles frame or are sort of broad points of agreement within African American political thought, or they are broad expressions within Black political thought. But of course, the very specific lens one looks through to see and understand and interpret these principles matter. Now, so Black disillusioned liberalism is right there in the center, sort of in between radical egalitarianism or liberal integrationism, Black Marxism, a little bit away from Black feminist and LGBT thought, but not terribly away from, or Black nationalist thought. Well, and to what degree might African Americans be in a state of disillusioned liberalism? A sense that what is disillusioned liberalism? The sense that one would hope that racism can be overcome in the American system, that anti-racism can succeed in American political system. But is America irreparably racist, irreparably divided by race as well as other forms of oppression? And so disillusioned liberals aren't sure. Unlike radical egalitarians, they're not sure. And so they're in a state of flux, and is Black America in a state of flux as a result? Now remember that I also talked about the ways in which the engagement of African Americans across age ranges predominantly matter. And so whether we're talking on one side, and I'll permit you certainly to go back and view these clips, on one side are we talking about the hope and the optimism of an Alicia Keys, who talked about sort of love being a conquering force, and her strong belief that Hillary Clinton was the candidate to stand behind, or which is on the left side, or on the right side, Mr. Newsom, who argues that as a Black Lives Matter activist, African Americans should not have voted. They should lodge a protest vote. So different outcomes entirely in the context of that election. Initial outcomes that were quite different entirely. But these two pictures and these two clips portray the ways in which African Americans, even within age groups, struggle around what path is morally, politically, and economically justified for African Americans to take. By the way, my music is William Grant Still, an African American symphonic composer of the 1930s, 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Now remember that up to this point we had been talking about the thinking and framework of various great thinkers. In this particular case, I'm talking about Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And Garvey has this quote of, "Liberate the minds of men, and ultimately you will liberate the bodies of men." So in what way did Garvey see the struggle within the broader African American struggle as a struggle for black minds? You can see that in just from this picture that Garvey was a bit of a master propagandist, and I use that word objectively, not in a pejorative or bad way, but in an objective sense. Garvey knew how to use propaganda, the written word, the spoken word, the image, the symbol, to motivate masses of people. You see that Garvey is dressed in, he himself, Garvey is of Afro-Jamaican ancestry, so he knows quite a bit about questions of British rule. But he's wearing a British Field Marshal's uniform, and complete with the plume, the extravagant plume in his hat, the epaulets, and all the sort of military medals accompany. And here, this would have been a picture of Garvey riding in his presidential car as the UNIA had one of its great UNI parades up the street, probably 125th Street or somewhere thereabouts in Harlem. Parading in the 1920s with one of its great conventions, the Convention of Negro Peoples of the World, gathering thousands of people in Madison Square Garden. So it was a mass event. And again, Garvey knew how to motivate and use these images, these symbols, these words to mobilize. But we also see up to this point that there are other ways in which popular culture may be direct examples or exemplars of black political thought. And so I'm giving you these examples to think about in sort of a praxis-like way. So whether we're talking about the ways in which black political thought can be seen in black popular culture by way of the music of Beyonce and the Formation album, or the Formation song, in the I think it's Netflix series Luke Cage, that they both portray images of black nationalism, but to some degree also images of womanism. Or Erykah Badu and her sort of Afrocentric music that portrays images of ancient Egyptian civilizations, of Egyptian civilization, and also speaks to a certain bluesy sort of womanism in her music as well. Then the artwork of Kehinde Wiley, who sort of bends Eurocentric images. On the left side is the image of the Emperor Napoleon being crowned at his coronation as the Emperor of France. But Kehinde Wiley took this image and he put not Napoleon but Ice-T, and uses and has used other images to kind of portray. Oh, there's my Luke Cage image. Sorry, but other images that are rooted in sort of European classical art, but uses these images to transform these images into African classical beauty. And then the film by Barry Jenkins, Moonlight, about the struggle of the young man Sharon, who grows up poor, and, an African American young man poor in the ghetto, and is working through his identity, his sense of self, his sexuality, and his love for another man. But how does the politics of LGBT life and black class politics, how are they portrayed in that particular film? Okay, so up to this point, we've also sort of had a discussion of the ways in which feminism and nationalism are critical well, what am I trying to say? How feminism and nationalism are important to black political thought. And one example of this is the thinking of Florence or Flo Kennedy when she talks about sexism and capitalism. And each of these I want to sort of suggest to you is that there are intersections between schools of thought, not just simply one school of thought, but intersections of various schools of thought. As exhibited by what I just sort of provided with you in the previous slide. So, how is sort of black Marxists as well as black feminists evident when Flo Kennedy says very few jobs actually require a penis or a vagina? All other jobs should be open to everybody else. And then how does Malcolm X combine nationalism or revolutionary nationalism and sort of social democratic or black socialist thought in talking about racism and capitalism when he says you can't have capitalism without racism? Now, this particular slide is one I have discussed or referenced earlier about the inequalities of wealth. And I want you, if you get an opportunity, to click on that upper left-hand link that talks about income inequality in the United States. And it's because it's a fascinating, only about 6 or 7 minutes, but it's a fascinating video that portrays just how vast the inequalities are in wealth among the Americans, particularly the very top 1% versus the lower quartile or the lower quarter. But there are these inequalities cut across race and class, of course. And so you can see that on that chart to the left, wealth by race and ethnicity, 2007 to 2013. Median net worth of households in 2013 dollars. That median net worth, meaning that's the middle number. When you take the assets of these various families, what was the middle number of all of these numbers across the distribution of possible numbers? And so you can see that all households between 2007 and 2013, the very top set of bars, lost wealth, went from $135,000 net worth to $81,000. And that's, of course, adding up what you owe versus what you own, or what you have as liquid assets, subtracting the two, and that's the net. Then when you look at for whites, 192,000 versus 141,000, so a definite loss there between 2013 and 2007. But when you look at African Americans, there's actually not that great. There's a great drop, but it's not that great a drop because it's that small. From 19,000, which was a definite gain, but back to 11,000 for Hispanics, 23 to 13. But notice that $11,000 is still a infinitesimally smaller number. So median net worth is $11,000 for African Americans. That's a much smaller number than is true for whites, 141,000. So whites have 10 times the net worth of African Americans. And you can see that by the ways in which there's a persistent gap in between. In that chart in the middle, racial, ethnic wealth gaps have grown since the Great Recession. And you can see that, again, the numbers have simply enlarged, if you will, between groups, both for African Americans and whites as a comparison versus Hispanics and whites. or non-white Hispanics. So that's the basis for talking about, well, we have this great income inequality in the United States. It cuts by race. How might socialist or Marxist or radical thought be attractive to various groups, African American being among them, very much in the contemporary sense, but what has been true historically? Another way I pose this question is, so why Black Lives Matter but not Occupy? So why was there in the Occupy movement, the movement that emerged arguing for the idea that these vast inequalities must be challenged? And so the Occupy movement that emerged in the midst of the Great Recession, and sort of very similar to what occurred in the 1930s during the Great Depression. How did Occupy certainly challenge the thinking that, that the 1% is entitled to the vast degree of wealth that it commands in the United States, and the top 1% does command an enormous amount of the total? But that movement was not particularly a multiracial movement, or you didn't see as strong African American participation in that movement as is true of Black Lives Matter. And of course, Black Lives Matter, it makes more sense that there's more participation in that movement. But another way I would frame this question is, what prevents sort of multiracial movements in the United States that call for questions of economic inequality to be challenged? Why were some younger African Americans, but not African Americans in large numbers, more supportive or less supportive of Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016 for the Democratic nomination, when clearly Sanders was sort of benefited from, or was a springboard from, the Occupy movement? So what prevents class solidarity across racial groups in the United States? That's the question to think through. And we also can kind of think in what ways why communism and socialism have their problems, or have their, not problems is the wrong way to say it, but have challenges when it comes to how they have been, sort of implemented by way of the great historical example. So whether we're talking about North Korea, or communist North Korea, or we're talking about the Soviet Union, or if we're talking about Cambodia, or we're talking about China, the examples that are provided by these communist states do not argue for a certain radical egalitarianism, do not argue for the adherence to or observance of human rights in a broad respect, do not speak to a sort of democratic, a mass democratic political system. In fact, when Joseph Stalin, in the upper right-hand corner, came to power after the death of Lenin in 1924, Stalin absolutely dispensed with any Leninist insistence, or any individuals who would follow Lenin that argued still for democratic governance in what became the USSR, or a communist, really kind of dictatorship and totalitarian state, the Soviet Union. In fact, with the Great Purge, Stalin implemented a great purge of all those he deemed disloyal and counter-revolutionary, so that by 1939, 1/4 of the entire Soviet officers' corps, all of those who were officers in the Soviet army, were imprisoned in draconian Russian gulags. 1 million party members were expelled, and by the end of his reign of terror in the early 1950s, it's estimated that over 1 million people had been executed. And there's a difference between Stalinism versus Marxism. It is a Stalinist communist, or it is Stalinist communism. Communism falling after Joseph Stalin's example, that some argue set the Soviet Union on a path to anti-democratic denial of human rights and the absolute repression of all political dissent.
Marxist-Leninists would argue that Stalin was a historically corrupting influence upon communism. So those who followed after Lenin versus Marx, those who followed after Marx and Lenin in orthodox or strict sense would very likely challenge or be upset by the example that Stalin left of communism. For in truth, real socialism or communism are much more humane and egalitarian than capitalism. Is certainly what Marxist-Leninists would argue. So, but again, you have all these other examples, whether we're talking about Chairman Mao of China, of General Pol Pot of Cambodia, or Chairman Mengistu of Ethiopia, each of them being brutal or fairly brutal communist regimes. So the actual examples, historical examples, or some of the historical examples, do leave much to be desired in terms of whether or not communist states are democratic, humane, egalitarian states. But I want to say that it is important for us to make a distinction between, and we will make a distinction between communism and socialism as political philosophies, and I'll pull that apart in my lecture comments. So as you know, with every lecture I begin with some quotes, and so check out this quote. Capitalism was built on the exploitation of black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both black and white, both here and abroad. So I think I previously asked you who said this. Is it Paul Robeson, Martin Luther King Jr., or Angela Davis? Now, and if you guessed either Paul Robeson or Angela Davis, that would be absolutely great choices. Those are very good choices. Now, it was Martin Luther King Jr. who said that. Now, why would Martin Luther King? Well, we think of Martin Luther King Jr. as a liberal integrationist. Why would we suspect that he wouldn't have been the best candidate for that quote, if that's what you believe, or if that's what your initial guess was? Well, by the end of his life, King was probably a social democrat. He was being greatly influenced throughout his thinking to think about questions of economic inequality, certainly by the Poor People's March on Washington that happened after King's assassination, led by many of his lieutenants, including Ralph Abernathy and Coretta Scott King, and that King surrounded himself with individuals who had social democratic or communist sympathies, whether we're talking about Bayard Rustin or Stanley Levinson, one of King's official ghostwriters. So King, like many African-American intellectuals, thinkers, leaders, have certainly merged one school of thought with another, or certainly considered the virtue of one school of thought in conjunction with another. Then another quote: "We Negro communists do not accept the status of aliens to which the Negro Resolution relegates us. We are an integral part of the Negro movement, embodying the great revolutionary traditions of Nat Turner, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, etc. We do not become foreigners when we become communists. It is therefore not only the right but the duty of Negro communists to project forms and methods of struggle consistent with the great revolutionary traditions of the Negro people." So, this quote was given by the great Harry Haywood, whose life kind of represents the shift in how communists, and white communists in particular, looked at African-American communists in this period. Did Harry Haywood say these words in 1919, 1939, or 1959? Actually, he said it in 1959. Well, why did he give this particular quote? What is the meaning behind this particular quote? Well, American communists saw racial solidarity as counter-revolutionary by this time. And when I say American communists, I'm talking American communists broadly speaking, but more specifically, white communists. They saw sort of racial solidarity among African Americans as counter-revolutionary. So this idea of black unity, that is using race to break down class solidarity, that class solidarity is much more important. So they saw racial solidarity as counter-revolutionary to class solidarity, and black radicals were being purged from some black civil rights groups due to McCarthyism. So this 1959 resolution to which Harry Haywood is challenging, he's challenging these broader resolutions being passed by the Communist Party that argues that African Americans are part of should blend in as part of a broader class struggle. And he's saying, no, that's problematic. That does not speak to the radicalism of the black tradition, or the black radical tradition. And there is, as Robin Kelly says in his book, clearly a black radical tradition throughout aspects of African American history. Okay, so in this lecture, what I'm going to do is help you to understand the black attraction to socialist and communist thought, even given American suppression, and how these schools of thought had sort of interesting racial contradictions within them, but they certainly did challenge the sort of class inequalities of America. And here I'm showing you sort of various pictures of the moments in African American radical history. Here's a picture of the Scottsboro Boys. Think of 1939, where these young men were falsely accused, and many of them to the point or were being sentenced to death for the rape of a white woman. Again, it was a false accusation. The group that came to their defense was the International Labor Defense League, a communist organization that saw it as critically important to promote civil rights and racial inequality. And that group successfully defended these Scottsboro Boys. Because they did that, they gained great sympathies within the African American community. And so for a short period, communists were seen as being sort of radical allies in the black community, because for that period they were stressing the need for civil rights and racial equality. Then the middle picture is a picture from the Black Panther Speaks newspaper, a cartoon portraying sort of a revolutionary arms being taken up against the police, the pigs, as the Panther Party frequently would name them. And then at the bottom is a picture of an organization that emerged in the late 1990s into the 2000s, the Black Radical Congress. And we'll talk more about that organization toward the end of my lecture. So first we'll talk about the core tenets of black Marxism and radicalism. And I use the term radicalism as a more of an umbrella term to speak to Marxist, socialist, communist thought as a sort of broad umbrella of schools of thought. So radicalism sort of covers all of these schools, if you will, or radical in the sense of the radical left. Then what is the black attraction to versus opposition to communism and socialism? In what ways have African Americans been attracted to these schools of thought? How have African Americans been repelled by them? And then I'll return back to the class question, contemporary black inequalities in black and white. All right, so I'm showing you pictures of sort of the foundational founders of Marxist, Leninist, communist thought. Whether we're talking about Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, Hegel, V.I. Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution of Russia, or Joseph Stalin. Here I'm throwing you pictures of African Americans and people of African descent who have led relative to communist thought, and might argue that, again, that black thought, African or African American thought, is not inconsistent with communism. In fact, They would argue that there are real consistencies in terms of radicalism, and that African thought centers itself in communitarianism or communalism, similar to communism. So I'm showing you a picture here of Paul Robeson, of Kwame Nkrumah, who we've discussed at length before, and of course Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture. Okay, so revisiting Marxism. Let's talk about Marxism. I gave a discussion of this school of thought in the last third of the lecture. That was the introductory lecture. But let me just give some points of summary in terms of the school of thought, and you can use this to as a sort of a primer, if you will. Oh, I forgot to read my poem. I had a poem here from Langston Hughes. I'll go ahead and read my poem real quickly, because it's a poem that Langston Hughes wrote in 1934, and he was parodying, he was making fun of Carl Sandburg's poem Good Morning America. It was written when Hughes, like many artistic intellectuals of the Harlem Renaissance, was attracted to communist Russia and what he saw as the potential of a socialist revolution held for black liberation. The poem goes, "Good morning, revolution. You're the very best friend I've ever had. We're going to pile around together from now on. Say, listen, revolution, you know the boss where I used to work, the guy that gave me the air to cut down expenses, he wrote a long letter to the papers about you. Said you was a troublemaker, an alien enemy. In other words, a son of a bitch. He called up the police and told them to watch out for a guy named Revolution." So that's Langston Hughes' romance with communist or socialist thought. So let's talk about Marxism or orthodox Marxism. Now, allow me to explain what I mean by socialism, communism, and Marxism. If we think of these terms in the way that Marxists or Karl Marx thought of them, and Karl Marx was a German economic historian and political theorist who lived between 1818 and 1893. And he spent some 20 years in the British Museum in London researching the first volumes of his magnum opus, Das Kapital, or other words, Capital. Marxism, again, differs from Leninism, of V.I. Lenin's formation, or Stalinism, Joseph Stalin's formulation. So getting back to, again, sort of Marxism as is defined, or communism is defined by Marxism, is defined as a moment in history. Communism is defined as a moment in history in which labor is highly productive, but there is no productive private accumulation of wealth, hence no exploitation of labor. Production, economic production, is for social use only, not for the market. One doesn't sell on the market, doesn't sell your labor or sell goods. Things are produced so that they meet social needs. Because a communist society is a society in which there is no class conflict, because there's no class hierarchy, but complete class inequality. In its most idealistic formulation, communism means the absence of state repression, because there is no state or government at all due to high degrees of human social evolution and collective cooperation. Socialism, by contrast, is the period of transition from capitalism to complete communism, as brought about by a revolution. A socialist society is one characterized by the state rule of workers as a class over capitalists, or what Marx and later Lenin referred to as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Okay? So, now, what is... So that's the sort of the broad tenets of socialism, Marxism, communism. Let's review the assumptions of Marxism real quickly. So here's the first assumption of Marxism. History is ruled by a dialectic or conflict-ridden process which progresses from one state to another. So the study of this process is called historical materialism. 2. 2, capitalism is a historical development which naturally flows from the human processes or the modes and forces of production. The modes of production are roughly the different moments in history that correspond to the different types of political economies a society can possess, from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. Capital accumulation is derived through labor wage exchange is a central motor of capitalism. And these are just broadly, I'm giving you these assumptions in broad sense. You don't have to memorize these, of course. Again, capital accumulation is derived through labor wage exchange. The classes of bourgeoisie, the capitalists, and the proletariat, or the workers, arise as historical responses to the changing needs of production, and class conflict is a necessary tension which will militate for the transformation of society into an eventually classless society. So we've talked about Marx, Hegel, and Engels. Marx was certainly joined and inspired by his life in his lifelong project with Friedrich Engels. Friedrich Engels lived between 1820 and 1895, who wrote much of what he wrote as a response to Hegel's notion that the idea is the supreme motivator of human history, as opposed to Marx's emphasis upon the materialist notion. Let me pull that apart. Friedrich Engels and Hegel, Hegle, both believed in the notion that ideas are the supreme motivators of human history. Ideas are what move history forward. Ideas and ideologies. Marx believed material relations, economic issues, material outcomes is what moved history forward. Both of them say that these are the different bases on which there's conflict within a society. A conflict over ideas or a conflict over material outcomes. Lenin, one of the great sort of revisions upon Marxism is that which was offered by V.I. Lenin in his construction of the Russian Revolution led by the Bolshevik Party in 1918. Lenin believed that in order to spark a revolution, a vanguard party is necessary. A fellow Marxist comrade by the name of Rosa Luxemburg was to disagree with Lenin as to the pervasiveness of the vanguard party and the dominance of the state or the government. However, both agreed on the concept of democratic centralism. Okay. And I will just go through that. Lenin believed in collective leadership and division of the labor under the direction of a central body consisting of elected representatives. 2, the accountability of all representatives, including the right to recall them immediately. 3, the subordination of the decision of lower bodies to those of higher bodies, conscious and voluntary acceptance of party decisions by every party member. And 4, open debate and criticism. So that's Lenin's vision, which was a democratic vision of communism. Very different from what we said was true, again, of Stalin. So I've already talked about the ways in which socialism and communism differ from each other. Communism is the complete class equality. There is no class. It's a classless society, a classless state. Where socialism, it's a period of transition between capitalism and communism. And in socialism, there are still classes, but the dominant class is the proletariat or working class in a purely socialist world. So, what are the ways in which black radicalism, black communism, Marxism, socialism have embraced these principles that I just laid out? And how have the black radicalism interpreted these principles? And again, I'm drawing once again from the work of Michael Dawson in this regard. First of all, African American radicals have believed in what was called the national question. In other words, they disagreed with their white communist brothers and sisters, or comrades as they would say, that to emphasize race and racism, to see race and racism as simply an outgrowth of class tension. They disagreed on that question, that it is important to understand racism and capitalism as linked processes, but not one and the same. One cannot account for the other completely. And so it is important for African Americans to have self-determination as a group in alliance with, in unity among themselves and in alliance with others. And so the national question raises the issue of seeing the national culture or politics of African Americans as one nation within a nation as critically important to this broader revolutionary struggle. Secondly, super exploitation and the racial nature of capitalism. So, as Eric Williams would argue, capitalism and slavery went hand in hand. That were it not for capitalism, there would not have been slavery. If there had not been slavery, there would not have been racism. And so, at each of these turns in American history, whether we're talking about slavery, whether we're talking about the peonage or sharecropping system under Jim Crow, the convict lease system, or the modern new Jim Crow of mass incarceration and the exploitation of individuals given privatized prisons. All of these are ways in which capitalism has created an impulse for racial inequality as well as economic exploitation. Thirdly, class conflict and Black United Fronts. So the Black Panther Party, the Black Radical Union movement, various other manifestations of Black radicalism in the 20th century and into the 21st century have argued that it's important to bring about a united front among African Americans to bring about a way in which you, like for instance with the Black Radical Congress, that you bring together sort of radical leftist progressive forces under a broad umbrella. But it is also important to recognize that class privilege, that the middle class and upper classes within Black America do and have privilege that they can use to exploit, in their view, the working class and the poor. And so that it's not simply racial unity, but it's racial unity toward the ends of serving the economic interest of those who are working class and who are the working class masses. Gender. Black radicals have integrated gender as clearly as the thinking of Claudia Jones, the thinking of Lucy Parsons, as I'll talk about in a minute, or Angela Davis. All of these were African American women who saw the gender question as important as is the class and race question, and integrated that gender question and the exploitation of gender. Florence Kennedy, as we just said a moment ago, integrated the gender question in with the question about class exploitation. Alliances with non-blacks. So along with feminists, I would argue that Black radicals are the most likely schools of thought. Well, maybe I should say, actually, Black feminists, Black radicals, and then I'd also say certainly liberal integrationists. These are all schools of thought that believe in alliances with groups outside of the African American community. And certainly Black radicals have struggled to create these alliances. Even when the Black Panther Party was clearly a more Black nationalist organization with elements of it being revolutionary, it still argued for alliances. As the great Fred Hampton, a brilliant 19-year-old man who became the chairman of the Chicago state chapter of the Black Panther Party, as Fred Hampton would always say at his rallies, Black power for Black people, white power for white people, red power for red people, yellow power for yellow people. What he was saying in the language of the 1960s was that all of these powers are, and he'd even say white power for white people, all of these are people powers, and these people powers can come together if they come together around a progressive agenda. Then Black radicals, communists, socialists, Marxists have believed in the liberation of Africa. They have been Pan-Africanist. Kwame Nkrumah, Kwame Ture were Pan-African communists, among many other examples. And they all sort of challenged thus imperialism as European colonialism, as they also challenged capitalism. In fact, Lenin talking about imperialism being the highest stage of capitalism. Then they believed in culture. And what ways do you combine, as was true for, as a group we'll talk about, the African Blood Brotherhood, and what ways do you combine the cultural question with the class question? In other words, that, to go back to what Kwame Nkrumah said, that there are within African cultures a way in which the communal, collective, communitarian sense of the culture speaks to a certain equality that would be attractive to those who are radicals. And in this sense, you could say that is it possible, besides what Asante says, is it possible for black radicalism, black Marxism, socialism, communism to combine with elements of black or with Afrocentrism? Possibly. And then clashes with nationalists. There were no more, or haven't been any more intense clashes within schools of thought than between black Marxists and radicals and black nationalists. One prime example is Marcus Garvey falling out with the black communists and radicals of the 1920s. In the sense that Garvey went so far as to describe himself as a collective capitalist. And although initially Garvey was warmed to the efforts of the outreach of the communists, he became quite suspicious. And keep in mind that some of these same black radicals, such as A. Philip Randolph, among others, and not all of them were radicals, clearly not all radicals, but some of the black radicals were seeing Garvey as being counter-revolutionary, being reactionary, and being what Garvey was, which is someone who argued for racial purity. And so, that's one example. Another example is the epic conflict between the Black Panther Party and the US organization of Maulana Karenga. It was a conflict precipitated by police COINTEL intervention, and there were provocateurs that stoked these fights fictitiously, artificially between the Black Panther Party and the US organization of the cultural nationalists that resulted in actual shootouts and deaths. And again, these were precipitated conflicts, but there were clearly ideological conflicts already when the Black Panther Party referred to us as sort of pork chop nationalists or cultural nationalists, not revolutionary nationalists. So, having said this, what are the ways in which African Americans have been attracted to, and then later we'll talk about opposed to, socialism and communism? So, reasons for attraction to Marxism. Anti-racism. Okay? So, there's a long list of sort of black intellectuals, artists, activists, and politicians who had at one point flirted with, contemplated, or embraced socialism or communism as pathways to black liberation. Let me give you a few names. From Henry Highland Garnett, who we've talked about before, to W.E.B. Du Bois, to A. Philip Randolph, to Lucy Parsons, to Claude McKay, to Richard Wright, for a moment, to Langston Hughes, to Paul Robeson, to Martin Luther King Jr., to Malcolm X, to Angela Davis, Huey Newton, Assata Shakur, Amiri Baraka, Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, Manning Marable, and so on. And this attraction is principally due to these reasons. 1. Anti-racism. Socialists or communists have at times developed a sharp racial critique of capitalism and thus have advocated interracial alliances and anti-racism activism. For instance, it was the communist organizers of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, who in the late 1930s and early 1940s advocated for black inclusion in industrial trade unions, unlike their conservative counterparts in the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. The legendary Scottsboro case, sorry, I said 1939, of 1931 was one in which 9 Alabama black men dubiously accused of raping 2 white women were successfully defended by the International Labor Defense League, or the International Labor Defense, the ILD. This particular episode did much to publicize the purported racial egalitarianism and advocacy of communist organizations. This was true in places as far-flung as Harlem, New York, and in places like rural Alabama. Alternatives to American capitalism. African Americans have often been critical of capitalism, or at least critical of the gross inequalities perpetuated by the American economic system and institutional racism. and thus have been attracted to the class analysis of socialists or communists and their calls for wealth redistribution. Such was the case when, during the Depression years of the 1930s, as well as the political upheaval of the mid to late 1960s, black revolutionary nationalists like the African Blood Brotherhood, the Black Panther Party, the League of Revolutionary Black Worker, or Kwame Toure's All-African People's Revolutionary Party integrated socialist or communist theories into their conceptions of black, Pan-African, or working-class people of color liberation. Thirdly, anti-poverty black working rights. And actually I already sort of went over elements of that before. But here I talk about the attacks on black employment and evictions during the Great Depression, the unemployment councils of the Great Depression, and these unemployment councils of the Communist Party of the United States were often very racially integrated, unlike other formations. The Knights of Labor accepted black workers, whereas the American Federation of Labor discriminated. And then again, I've already said, the CIO accepted, though later red-baited, black radical unionism. The CIO accepted, though later red-baited, various African-American intellectuals and groups, and the black radical unionism emerged in the 1960s. Then third world alliances. Lastly, socialist or communist governments and thinkers have inspired African-American leftists with alternative modes of what constitutes ethical and egalitarian society, in contrast to, quote, America's bourgeois racial capitalism. They have served as important third world allies and have literally given the leftists refuge from the backlash of American anti-radicalism and anti-communism. For instance, black intellectuals no less luminary than Du Bois or Robeson have made sojourns to the Soviet Union, or Mao Zedong's China, and have praised the examples they perceived is the important word, of democratic centralized planning, full employment, and revolutionary fervor. The sixth, and I'll read this, the Sixth Communist International, these are all from my notes, or Comintern, the Sixth Communist Internationale, or Comintern, which was the worldwide conference of communist parties sponsored by the Soviet Union, had as part of its official platform in 1926 a call for the self-determination of the American Black Belt, arguing that communists should support the building of an independent black state. Now, with the rise of Joseph Stalin, this commitment was soon forgotten. Socialist or Marxist revolutionaries or regimes on the African continent have likewise inspired African American and Afro-Caribbean activists, including Julius Nyerere, African social Julius Nyerere's NJERE, African socialism in Tanzania. So Nyerere had what he called African socialism in Tanzania. Kwame Nkrumah and his Pan-African Marxism, or Amilcar Cabral and Thomas Sankore of Guinea-Bissau. Fidel Castro, who, as you know, has recently passed, and his communist government of Cuba was given political asylum to diverse groupings of black expatriates, including Joanne Cesarmar or Assata Shakur of the Black Panther Party. To be sure, the fall of the Soviet Union and its patronage and the swerve to the right in China's Maoism has occasioned the fall of many formerly communist regimes in the Third World. In the late 1960s, following the overt intimidation assaults of the FBI and local enforcement authorities launched against the black left, many black militants went underground and joined Marxist or neo-Marxist study cells and organizations such as the Communist Workers' League. Okay, that's a lot, but that's just to give you an overview of why the attraction. Now, why the opposition? All right, so why the disaffection with Marxism? As Manny Marable observes in the 1983 essay entitled, Why Black Americans Are Not Socialist, that sort of echoes an essay Richard Wright penned about 40 years earlier. African Americans have been critical of socialism, communism, or Marxism because African Americans certainly can be capitalist, or certainly aspire to be capitalist. So, despite African American critiques of capitalism, there's also an indigenous conservatism in the black community that supported a notion of black capitalism. It began in large part with Booker T. Washington's diatribes against socialism, radicalism, and Negro participation in the budding trade union movement. Washington was not a fan of labor movements, of labor unions. Washington, as you know, was more concerned with racial self-reliance, entrepreneurial capitalism, and the free market. This model of group capitalism inspired Marcus Garvey in the 1920s, Elijah Muhammad in the Nation of Islam from the 1930s to the 1970s, and a group of black capitalists who emerged in the late 1960s in response to President Richard Nixon's call for black capitalism. Among them were Floyd McKissick and Roy Innis of CORE, Earl Graves, who founded Black Enterprise Magazine, you see it at the top, John H. Johnson of John H. Johnson Publishing, and Tony Brown of the Tony Brown's Journal. The leftist side of the camp was taken up by Jesse Jackson and his Operation Push at Corporate Justice. So calls for black capitalism have often coincided with the maturation of a new generation of the black middle class. Black religion and the atheism of communism. The role of religion in the black community has provided yet another barrier to socialism. The language of black politics has always been conditioned by the idiom of the church, of the symbols, the culture of the black church. Opposition to Marxism and socialism often comes from black preachers and those most heavily influenced by them. Atheism could never be popular among a peasant and working class people, as many have observed, whose nationality and identity were forged in part through faith in their churches and in the just God. Though Cornel West in his book Prophesied Deliverance, make sure my music's not up too loud, makes a compelling case for early examples of where black Christian ministers fueled a radical interpretation of Jesus, ministry to the poor, and oppressed with Marxist theory. Let me start that again. That's a long sentence. Though Cornel West in his book Prophesied Deliverance says the following. He makes a compelling case for early examples of where black Christian ministers fused a radical interpretation of Jesus' ministry to the poor and oppressed with Marxist theory, placing the proletariat at the center of social change and revolution. Black Southern ministers, who no doubt used orthodox biblical interpretations, provided some of the staunchest opposition to alliances with socialists and communists, as Robin Kelly argues was true with black Alabama communists. Although Martin Luther King Jr. was advised by Stanley Lewinson, Lewison, an avowed communist, and King turned toward a fairly radical democratic socialism in the late 1960s. In his book, Where Do We Go From Here? King was always critical of full-fledged communism and its denial of human liberty and its atheism. Bourgeoisie liberalism and anti-communism. Further, to the degree black leaders and communities have fully embraced the key principles of Western liberal thinking, including the concepts of individual liberty, property, and a free market, is the same degree that they are likely to see socialism or communism as antithetical, fundamentally opposed to the black realizations of the American dream. Though many of its initial white patrons were American socialists, the NAACP, particularly under the conservative leadership of Walter White and later Roy Wilkins, was strongly anti-communist in the 1940s and 1950s. To be sure, white citizen councils' attacks upon the organizations in states such as Georgia and Alabama is combined with McCarthyism, Senator Josie McCarthy's movement that was inherently anti-communist, and red-baited folk with an extremely broad cloth as really a means of policing political thought. These various things compelled the NAACP and its leaders to be extremely careful as it built alliances toward its legalistic approach to defeating racial segregation. I think I've said in a previous class that none other than the famous Thurgood Marshall was compelled to cooperate with the FBI because it was presumed that if he did not cooperate and hand a list of names of individuals seen as pro-communist, as communist sympathizers, that the organization would be under direct political heat from the FBI. Paternalism, dogmatism, and racism. Okay, so there has been an historic tension between black nationalists and socialists. It's evident from Marcus Garvey's duel with A. Philip Randolph. Okay, again, turn down the music. There's been a tension between black nationalists and socialists. It's evident with Marcus Garvey's duel with A. Philip Randolph, Chandler Owens, and Cyril Briggs, or Karenga's US organization and the Black Panther Party. I'm not going to go through all of this, but let me give you one particular example from Richard Wright. Among the most notable African-American intellectuals to become disaffected with American socialists is Richard Wright, who wrote an essay to this effect and had a very strong critique of white communist paternalism in Harlem, as he found it in his book Native Son. Now, what do I mean by paternalism? Paternalism in the sense that black radicals were believed that white radicals viewed them as the younger comrades, the secondary comrades in the movement. We must inform you how to bring about informant revolution within your community. And so, and you don't understand that you're being duped by the capitalist system. This paternalism angered many African American radicals, to say, as though we don't know how to organize within our own communities. Harold Cruz also attacked this paternalism in The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, when he spoke of the communists in Harlem failing to cultivate racial or cultural consciousness and to label it as nothing less than counter-revolutionary and backwards. So there's a long sort of history to this in terms of the clash between communism, between the way in which paternalism, racism, and dogmatism within each of among white radicals, white communists would offend black radicals. Actually, from my own political biography, I should bring this up. Well, maybe I shouldn't. But anyway, I remember that it was sort of particular communist on the campus of Howard Universities. Those who followed the thinking of Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was a comrade of Lenin and later assassinated by Joseph Stalin. And Trotsky argued that cultural consciousness, or what Marxists refer to as the national question, was divisive to the ultimate aim of building a unified socialist revolution. So Trotskyites, organizations, and I won't name the organizations, but they were there, are those with whom I and my black nationalist or leftist comrades at Howard University and the University of Michigan had some of our most intense disagreements, partly when they arrogantly saw themselves as the vanguard of the people's struggle. Anyway, so there are these tensions that would argue why African Americans have also been opposed and disaffected by socialism and communism. So let me talk quickly about brief examples of black radicalism. And I'll talk about early black socialists and communists from the 1940s up until the 1920s first. So we'll discuss sort of Lucy Parsons, we'll discuss W.E.B. Du Bois, and we'll discuss Angelo Herndon. All right. So Lucy Parsons was one of a number of black women socialists who unfortunately have been buried in the pages of history. We know this also from the history of Claudia Jones. Born in 1853, Parsons joined the Socialist Labor Party in her mid-1920s. She married a radical Southerner, Albert Parsons, who had served briefly in the Confederate Army. I know, she is African American. Even before her husband was indicted for complicity in the deaths of 7 policemen during the Haymarket Square riot of May 4th, 1886, and executed in 1877, Lucy Parsons traveled the country in support of the socialist thinking. Most socialist historians have ignored her writings and activities against sexism and lynching, although a few have questioned her racial identity. So you can see that Lucy Parsons may have been a more lightly complected African American woman. Her contemporaries knew her as a militant supporter of the Industrial Workers of the World, or the Wobblies, and a defender of the Scottsboro 9 in 1931. Okay, Let's look at the life and times of W.E. Du Bois. Probably the most significant national black leader won over to socialism was Du Bois. Early socialist influences. While studying in Germany in the late 1880s, he encountered the thinking of many German democratic socialists. Du Bois viewed himself as socialist by 1904, and a bit budding socialist by 1904. In his journal, Horizon, and later in the NAACP publication, Crisis, he quote, advised the socialists that their movement could not succeed unless it included Negro workers, and wrote that it was simply a matter of time before white and black workers would combine their common cause combine in common cause against exploiting capitalists. Like Parsons, Randolph, and Herndon, Du Bois was impressed with the non-racist personal behavior of many white socialists and probably gravitated to leftist politics because they seemed to share his burning commitment to racial equality. As early as 1908, Du Bois made this point quite clearly. Quote, "The only part today which treats the Negroes as men, North and South, are socialist." Unquote. Okay, that was a pretty good imitation of Du Bois, wasn't it? However, Du Bois' conversion to Marxism did not begin until well after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1918 in Russia. Although in September 1916 he predicted that the war would create, quote, "the great emancipation of European women, the downfall of monarchies, and the advance of true socialism," unquote. When the autocracy fell in St. Petersburg 6 months later, the monarchy, Du Bois worried, quote, "the German menace is to be followed by a Russian menace." In the summer of 1921, this black editor was criticized by Claude McKay for neglecting to mention the accomplishment of the Soviet Union. Du Bois tartly rejected the slogan, "dictatorship of the proletariat," and informed McKay, quote, "I am not prepared to dogmatize with Marx and Lenin," unquote. He urged blacks to join a revolution, quote, he urged them not to join a revolution which they do not presently understand. But Du Bois continued throughout his life to move in the direction of greater embracing of radical thought and of socialism and communism. In fact, he was impressed in 1926 when he took a 2-month visit to the Soviet Union. He said, quote, "The abolition of poverty, schools were multiplying, workers were being protected with a living wage, nurseries for children, night schools, trade unions, and wide discussion," he asserted. Quote, "I stand in astonishment and wonder at the revelation of Russia that has come to me. I may be partially deceived and half informed." Du Bois knew something might have been up. "But if what I have seen with my own eyes and with my ears in Russia is Bolshevism, I am a Bolshevik," unquote. By 1931, he urged Crisis readers to study Das Kapital. During the Depression, Du Bois's affection for the Soviet model of socialism grew. Visiting Russia again in 1936, he was pleased with what he felt to be the nation's progress, but Du Bois was notoriously silent about the atrocities perpetuated by Stalin. During the Cold War, Du Bois' support for communism increased with the beginning of the Cold War of the 1950s. Persecuted by the federal government, his passport revoked, and his books banned from public libraries and universities, Du Bois concluded that Russia and China, which he later visited, were the only hope for liberating the oppressed peoples of color across the world. He later acknowledged the crimes of Stalinism, but urged that the Soviet state deserved praise for what he believed to be its positive influences in the national liberation movements in Africa, Asia, and America. In the Americas. In 1961, he officially joined the Communist Party and moved to Ghana, which had gained its independence in 1957. And then, lastly, Angelo Herndon. And you have a picture there of Herndon to the left of the screen there. Among the thousands of blacks who joined the Communist Party during the Great Depression, Angelo Herndon is perhaps the best known. Born in 1913, Herndon was a construction laborer and worked in the Kentucky coal mines. In 1930, he joined the party-led Unemployment Council of Birmingham, Alabama. 2 years later, he was arrested and jailed for possession of Marxist literature, provoking labor violence, and trying to establish a group in combination of persons colored and white, unquote. The case of Angelo Herndon became a national cause for the left and many white liberals. Philip Randolph drafted a resolution to free Herndon, which was presented to the 1936 AFL convention. NAACP attorney Thurgood Marshall supported the Herndon defense. In 1937, the Supreme Court narrowly reversed Herndon's conviction in a 5-4 vote. However, Herndon, like many black leftists or radicals of the post-war era, broke with the party. All right, so let's talk. And I think I've already mentioned the Comintern and the Great Depression, so I'm not going to go back over that. But remember when I said the 1926 to 1928 Comintern, Communist International, which were international conventions being held by those sympathetic to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. So, again, their national question resolution was arguing that we should have a self-determination of the Black Belt, a self-determination of African Americans in the Southern Black Belt to resist the racism and economic exploitation of Jim Crow. Now, later on, as we've already discussed, this was completely de-emphasized and then considered counter-revolutionary. But again, this was what emerged in this period of the 1920s and 1930s before being reversed, certainly by the 1950s. Then another sort of fascinating organization is the organization of the African Blood Brotherhood that emerged in this period of the 1920s and 1930s. And let me just talk a little bit about the African Blood Brotherhood. Because it was a group that emerged in the 1920s. During the 1920s, probably only 200 Black Americans directly as opposed to indirectly joined this particular party. So it was a very small party. But among them were some of the most gifted writers and organizers of the Harlem Renaissance, like Cyril Briggs, Briggs, founder of the Revolutionary Black Nationalist Organization, the ABB, the African Blood Brotherhood. He was joined by other Afro-Caribbean comrades such as Claude McKay, the poet, Otto Husswood, Huiswood, and former Garveyites, former persons who were associated with Marcus Garvey, W.A. Domingo, Joshua Cockburn, and Alexander McGuire. Alexander McGuire, if I'm not mistaken, was the bishop of Garvey's African Orthodox Church for a while. Unlike the UNIA, the ABB was organized through local divisions or posts and soon claimed to have members throughout the United States and the West Indies, reaching maybe some 7,000 at its peak in 1923. Again, you can see that these numbers are a bit contested. At first, Briggs was a staunch admirer of Garvey. Cyril Briggs was an admirer of Marcus Garvey. But soon thereafter, they became bitter adversaries, with Marcus Garvey once referring to Briggs as white man and Negro for convenience. The propaganda war between the two men was fueled by the Bureau of Investigation's confidential, the FBI's, or the budding FBI's, confidential informant James Wormley, Agent 800, who infiltrated both the UNIA and the ABB. So the FBI had been infiltrating African American groups for quite a while, 1920s and with the Black Panther Party. Further, the paternalism of the Communist Party became evident in its relationship with Briggs. So I won't go on at length. But again, this is just to sort of talk about that this organization was quite key, although it did later disband. And what was true for Briggs later on in his life is in following the creation of the American Negro Labor Congress in 1925. Briggs was its national secretary and newspaper editor. In 1929, he was elected to the Central Executive Committee of the Communist Party of the USA. The following year of the American Negro Labor Congress became the League of Struggle for Negro Rights. He remained active in communist politics until 1939, when he was expelled from the Communist Party of USA because of his black nationalist leanings. So you can see these tensions. We've already talked about the Communist Party and the Harlem Unemployment Councils, so refer back to that discussion. But again, these are examples of what emerged with regards to black radicalism in the 20th century, in the early 20th century. And so I want to just sort of talk very quickly about most of these groups and a little more extensively about one or two. And I've given you a poster there or a montage or collage that shows various episodes in the life and times of the Black Panther Party. Oops, didn't mean to go ahead. And so, prior to the Black Panther Party was the National Negro Labor Congress, which was a precursor, which was also aligned with the National Negro Congress, and you had the Southern Negro Youth Congress. All of these groups, I would just simply say very quickly, had radical influences within them. Either they were in part had radical and or communist individuals within these organizations, or these organizations were led, if not allied, with these radicals. But having said this, all of these organizations also did fight on the front, with regards to the front, on civil rights, on rejecting Jim Crow, on trying to mobilize African Americans around political rights. Okay, let me talk about the Black Panther Party, and I'm not going to go on at length, but we do need to say a few words, because it would not do good justice at all to black radicalism to not discuss this most important party. So, the current Black Panther Party, the Black Panther Party, grew out of the African American political agitation and grassroots militancy of the 1960s. While attending Oakland Merritt Junior College, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale had become familiar with the period's various currents of black political thought, identifying initially with the Donald Warren's Afro-American Association, one of the pioneering black nationalist groups of the West Coast. Again, this is all in Oakland, California. After breaking with Warden, they briefly affiliated with the Revolutionary Action Movement, RAM, inspired by the Cuban-based guerrilla warfare advocate Robert Williams. I talked about Robert Williams in the previous lecture. Like other grassroots black activists of the period, Newton and Seale saw the need for an organization that would appeal particularly to young urban blacks from working class backgrounds. Greatly influenced by Marxist literature and Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, they also identified with Malcolm X's rhetorical attacks against white authority and black middle class leadership. They were drawn to his harsh criticism of established civil rights leaders who were deemed too cautious, dependent on white support, and unwilling to retaliate against white racist fighters. Newton later described the Panthers as a living testament to Malcolm X's life and his work. The platform and the program of the Black Panther Party. Following Malcolm X's assassination in February of 1965, Newton and Seale became more determined to find or create a black militant group that embodied Malcolm X's ideals. The massive rebellion in Los Angeles, the Watts riots of 1965, demonstrated that conditions were ripe for a new direction in African American politics. In October of 1966, this past October, so 50 years ago, Newton and Seale drafted the platform and program of the Black Panther Party at the offices of the North Oakland Service Center, a federal anti-poverty agency. Their list of 10 demands combined basic needs, full employment and decent housing, with more radical objectives. They took their name from the symbol of the Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee, the SNCC-inspired Lowndes County Freedom Organization in Lowndes County, Alabama. So, the Black Panther parties actually borrowed from the Civil Rights Movement and from the SNCC symbol. And there's other ways in which they borrowed from the Civil Rights Movement as well. The positions. Assuming the posts of the Defense Minister and Chairman, respectively, of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, Newton and Seale directed the group's rapid growth during the winter and spring of 1967. Their first recruit was a 16-year-old Oakland resident, Bobby Hutton, who became the party's treasurer. Another was David Hilliard, who became the chief of staff. One of those attracted to the BPP as it became increasingly visible outside the Bay Area was Eldridge Cleaver, a former convict and author whose autobiographical essays were were later collected in the bestseller Soul on Ice, 1969. It's an interesting volume. Cleaver soon became an active member, even being arrested with several members at a Sacramento protest. When he became editor of the Black Panther Community News Service and later Minister of Information, his uniquely caustic, bombastic verbal attacks on white authorities became part of the BPP's public image. Their program on self-defense. The party's considerable appeal among young African Americans was based less on its program or its leaders' Marxist rhetoric than on its willingness to confront the police and the issue of police brutality. The first issue of the Black Panther newspaper was dedicated to the killing of Denzel Dow, and during this period the party's principal activity was to patrol the pigs. That is, to monitor police activities to ensure that the civil rights of black people were respected. When the Panther members saw police pull over a black driver, they stopped and observed the incident, usually with weapons in hand. Newton carried law books in his car, and despite police objections, he would question police conduct, often drawing a crowd as he read aloud the relevant portions of the California Legal Code. So, I'm going to go through a few other key points about the party, and then I'm going to conclude quickly. So, in 1969, I do believe the Black Panthers' most publicized early action came after legislation was proposed in the California State Assembly that would make the Panther armed patrols illegal. And so the Panthers were asserting their Second Amendment rights and the infringement upon gun rights. And after reporters, they brandished weapons at the Capitol. After reporters gathered, the Panthers contingent distributed copies of Executive Mandate No. 1, which still read aloud, asserting that the American people should, quote, take careful note of the racist California legislature, who is now considering legislation aimed at keeping the black people disarmed and powerless at the very same time that racist police agencies throughout the country are intensifying the terror, brutality, murder, and repression of black people. There are other aspects to the Panthers' history. The Free Huey campaign. Newton was arrested in October of 1967 after an altercation with the police ended in the death of an Oakland police officer. The Sacramento event came before 1967, before this 1967 Free Huey campaign. As part of their support effort, Cleaver and Seal contacted Stokely Carmichael. An altercation with the police. Huey Newton was arrested in October 1967 after an altercation with the police ended in the death of an Oakland police officer. As part of the support effort, Cleaver and Seal contacted Stokely Carmichael, former chairman of the SNCC, and drafted him to be the party's prime minister, with offering administrative positions to other SNCC leaders. Unfortunately, the SNCC connected. The SNCC alliance began to unravel because Carmichael had not conferred with the SNCC leadership about the larger merger he announced between the two groups. And there were some ideological differences between the two groups. Keep in mind that although I talk about the Panthers as a revolutionary organization, a revolutionary nationalist organization, that characterized the West Coast Panthers most directly. The Midwest and East Coast Panthers were less of revolutionary nationalists and more explicitly political nationalist, although you could argue that Fred Hampton was certainly a revolutionary nationalist as well. And Fred Hampton, again, was the leader of the Panthers of Chicago or Illinois. So the Panthers did have, however, some variation, and in some cases wide variation, in the direct sort of ideological arguments that they would make. Would they make explicit and direct references and connections to communism and Marxism, or much less so? Well, one key point to discuss, two more key points and then I'll stop. And that's the COINTEL program waged against the Panthers. In early of 1968, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI initiated the COINTEL, or Counterintelligence Program, whose aim was to neutralize militant black nationalists to forestall the quote, a coalition of militant black nationalist groups, unquote, and to prevent the emergence of, quote, a black messiah, unquote, who, quote, I know a lot of quoting and unquoting, might unify and electrify these violence-prone elements. The numerous FBI dirty tricks, as the Panthers called, were directed against the Panthers, seriously disrupted the organization's effort and strengthened the tendency of Panthers to suspect the motives of black militants who questioned the group's strategy and tactics. It was really a divide and conquer tactic. On April the 6th, 1968, police attacked a house containing several Panthers, killing Hutton, the 17-year-old treasurer of the party, and wounding Cleaver. Cleaver fled to exile to Cuba and later Algeria to avoid conviction on parole violations. During 1969, continued FBI COINTEL plots directed against the BPP decimated its leadership and disrupted its relations with military organizations. In Southern California, these covert activities exacerbated conflicts between the party and the black cultural masses of Melania Karenga's US organization. It culminated in a gun battle on UCLA's campus that left 2 Panthers dead. In March 1969, Seal was arrested for conspiracy to incite rioting at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. In New York, 21 Panthers were charged with plotting to assassinate policemen and blow up buildings. Then in December 1969, police killed 2 Chicago Panther leaders, the great Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, while they were sleeping at Hampton's apartment. Though the police claimed they were attempting to disarm a cache of weapons used against them in the raid, subsequent investigations discovered more than 100 shots were fired into the building and only 2 shots were fired to the outside. The police raid was planned with the help of a police informer and coordinated with the U.S. Justice Department. Other covert operations by the FBI and local forces further intensified and sometimes created vicious factionalism within the party. So, and then we can talk about the rise and fall of the party, but what's critically important is that in 1970, Newton was released on bail since his murder conviction was reversed upon appeal. He attempted to stem the factionalism within the party, moving away from the revolutionary rhetoric and more toward community organized programming. The BPP concentrated on 4 main programs: the petition campaign for community control of the police, free breakfast for school children, free health clinics, and liberation schools. Despite these efforts, bitter disagreements continued. As Elaine Brown would concede, generally, quote, reduced to one man, Huey Newton, though the Central Committee still influenced the governing of the party since its members held individuals' fields of sway, unquote. It is critically important to know that black women, such as Elaine Brown, Kathleen Cleaver, and Erica Huggins, kept the party afloat in the early 1970s. But by the mid-1970s, degrees of male chauvinism, external attacks, and legal problems and internal schisms had caused the national organization to implode. Now, given that long discussion of the Panther Party, I won't go into depth about the Revolutionary Union movement, the League, but it was a critically important organization and really union movement that occurred in Detroit and was spurred elsewhere. And it was sort of revolutionary unionism, where the principles of Marxism and communism were brought to the shop floor and led across a number of sectors, led by African Americans, but often with white allies in the 1970s, or late 1960s, early 1970s. There's an important documentary called I Just Got the News that talks about the history and times of the League. The Black Radical Congress is somewhat of a precursor to the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Radical Congress was a organization in the late 1990s. It was an umbrella organization that had its roots in Chicago, but was definitely an organization connected to other parts of the Midwest, the East Coast, and the West Coast. And the Black Radical Congress, although it was a short-lived group, it did represent an effort in the mid-90s for black radicals to reassert the need to combine sort of elements of Pan-Africanism, Marxism, socialism, communism, or radical thought, along with feminism, all under a broad umbrella. And in fact, I remember attending one of the Black Radical Congress meetings in Chicago, and the way in which it sort of was a broad effort
to re-energize black radicalism in the 1990s. And in some ways, the Black Lives Matter movement sounds much like an echo of that Black Radical Congress. And so I think it is very key for us to be aware of these predecessor moments. Remember, I said that the Southern Negro Youth Congress preceded the Student Nonviolent Committee. The SNYC, the first SNCC, preceded the second SNCC, but the second SNCC didn't know about the first SNCC. I'd be curious to know how much the activists of the Black Lives Matter movement know not just about the Black Panther Party, but the Black Radical Congress in this sort of Black radical history and the ways in which one school of thought, one period, one organization is part of a broader genealogy of thinking. So very quickly, I'm going to end in discussing the income inequality. Now, my numbers are really dated in this particular set of the slides, but this income distribution is still quite relevant in the sense that you have the percentages of what percentage of this segment of the income distribution owns the total amount of wealth. So you can see those dark green bars from 1969 to 1995 just as one point, and it keeps going up astronomically. The top, the highest, or let's just say the richest, fifth of Americans own in 1969 40% of the wealth, or 40% of all income. By 1995, they own nearly half of all income. Income inequality continues to go up. So there are contemporary race and class politics that we might talk about in South Carolina. In the post-1960s period, there emerged a strong black middle class as a result of civil rights movement gains, but economic inequalities between whites and blacks persist, while class disparities among the black middle class and the black poor have widened. Black and white differences. This is just one example, but you know I've given you several others. Between 2003 and 2003, blacks on average earn about $30,000, while whites earn about $47,000. Black and white rich in 2000, about 14% of white families earned over $100,000. Only 6% of black families did. Black rich and poor. However, the gap between the black rich and poor has greatly widened, thus reflecting the presence of a small but growing black bourgeoisie. And then, again, this is just a re-articulation of those class differences that I talked about earlier on. So I'm sort of taking a loop in this lecture. But overall, I wanted to convey to you sort of this rich history, and I know I read quite a bit and gave you quite a bit of context, but I wanted to give you this rich history to black radicalism, both the pros and the cons, both the genius and the contradictions, the ways in which black thinkers, African-American activists have seen this particular school of thought, and I'm saying radicalism, but I mean Marxism and socialism, communism, the ways in which they've seen this particular school of thought as relevant to the black struggle and not relevant to the black struggle. Okay, I'm going to end it here. This has been a lecture by Dr. Todd Shaw at the University of South Carolina for the African American Studies class, African American Political Thought, POLI 201, AFAM 201, copyrighted by Dr. Todd Shaw.